What's going on, bottom line viewers? This is Kevole, your resident Seahawk expert, your Seahawk fan that is here to talk about the Seattle Seahawks training camp and what is 5 things that are going to be going on this training camp to keep an eye on. So 5 stories that we will be keeping an eye on going forward, or I will be keeping an eye on anyway as a Seahawks fan. Now, I would like to start by talking a little bit about a recent video that Mitch did about the most overrated teams in the National Football League, the 5 most overrated teams in the National Football League. Consensus by Mitch, myself, Dylan, and AC. And the consensus was the Seattle Seahawks were one of those 5 overrated teams in the National Football League. And that is interesting. I, of course, as a Seahawks fan, couldn't necessarily agree with that assessment. However, I do see, from an objective point of view, why you could look at the Seahawks that way. And the reason being a couple of things I think that are interesting. Of course, last season, the Seahawks offensive line was a huge story of how they were one of the worst offensive line, the worst offensive line, not one of the worst, the worst offensive line in the National Football League, having a left tackle that played basketball and never played football before is an issue, and they're caused a lot of problems. And really, the Seahawks were in an interesting, I don't want to say transition, but I mean, it's probably the best word that I could use for them. In some senses, they are, of course, I think everyone is picking them to win the NFC West. But I don't know how many of them are picking them to win the NFC West because of the strength of the team, or more of it's about the weakness of the division. You look at teams like the 49ers, they're expected to be one of the worst teams in the National Football League. Consensus also about the Los Angeles Rams, although they certainly could improve. That offense is not exciting anybody. So they're not a huge threat for many to win the NFC West. And then you have the Arizona Cardinals, who, in my mind, I actually voted them as one of the 5 most overrated teams in the National Football League, and we'll get into that at another time. But I just, to me, I feel like there's a lot of flash, but and certainly they can beat the Seahawks in a one-on-one matchups for sure. But can they win a division? I don't know if they're there yet. So, for many people, and it's certainly understandable, the Seahawks are in the weakest division in the National Football League. So that's probably why a lot of people are picking them to win the NFC West. But let's just quickly look at this from the other side of this. The NFC is actually, when you look at it, wide open. The Dallas Cowboys are going to be starting the season with a number of suspensions, another number of players off. So they could be off to a slower start this year. You look at the Green Bay Packers as another example, who the Seahawks opened the season against. Aaron Rodgers, of course, is top 2 quarterbacks in the National Football League. Nobody's going to dismiss that. But that defense doesn't scare a lot of people. And that team doesn't, quite frankly, scare a lot of people. You also look at a team like the Atlanta Falcons. And they are certainly going to be interesting because of the biggest collapse from their perspective in Super Bowl history. Where are the Falcons going to be this season? And then you have the Giants, who are perennial contenders in a lot of people's minds. You have the Detroit Lions, who a lot of us on Bottom Line View certainly seem to think are going to be a competitive team. But others are questioning them. They're considering them an overrated team. And then you got the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, who are certainly a team on the rise. But have they reached that level yet? We don't know. So that's where you look at the Seahawks. And I think the theme that I would use for the Seahawks is a risk-reward. Partially a good risk, partially there's some reward with them. And I think that they, I think this year, and the way that the training camp is going to be, and the stories that we talk about will fit into these themes. And the first one that we're going to talk about is the 2017 draft class, which included Keel Griffin, who they drafted as a safety and want to convert to a cornerback this year. And certainly with the Legion of Boom, there is a sense of transition or time to replace here. Pete Carroll and John Schneider have said quite consistently that it wasn't in their intention to replace the Legion of Boom, but this was the draft to do it. So Keel Griffin will be one of those guys that people will be watching. Also, the wide receivers. Arsh Doshaj is a big receiver. Certainly, Tyler Lockett failed his physical coming into camp, so that's not good. Other than Doug Baldwin, your wide receivers include Curse and Paul Richardson. And Curse did not have a great year last year. And Paul Richardson has shown flashes of brilliance, but he hasn't necessarily taken that next step to be a major wide receiver in the National Football League. And then you have Jimmy Graham, who I don't think has fit in to the Seahawks system as well as people have wanted him to. Certainly dynamic in New Orleans, and certainly a guy that is an absolute dynamic talent. I would argue if you traded Jimmy Graham to a few other teams, he would be used very well. But for some reason in Seahawk land, it's not working out as well. So getting another receiver, another weapon on the field to possibly help get a guy like Jimmy Graham open is certainly going to help. And that will be another one. And Malik McDowell, who the Seahawks traded down not once, but twice to get this guy. He was considered a top 5 talent by some scouts in the National Football League from the last draft. Started his training camp on an accident, an ATV accident, and not a great start for a guy that I think has a lot of pressure on him, not because he's a first-round pick, but because there are expectations on him. The Seahawks want to disrupt the pass rush. They want to create havoc up the middle. They want to dominate the line of scrimmage. And you don't want a guy starting in an accident. The ATV, not going to set your world on fire here. So that's interesting. So it's going to be interesting to see what the Seahawks draft has come up. And we also should add Ethan Pocic to that as well. A lot of people were arguing that the biggest need in Seattle, obviously, was the offensive line. And instead of a guy like McDowell, you could have drafted another offensive line. A couple of them that would have fit really well. They didn't. They went with a guy like Pocic, who has some versatility, but certainly a lot of questions as well. So I'm going to be intrigued and interested to see how that works going forward. So the draft and the rookies in the Seattle Seahawks is the number 5 story that I have for this training camp season. Number 4 is the Seahawks running game. One of the big acquisitions that the Seahawks made in the offseason was Eddie Lacy. Of course, as you know, Marshawn Lynch has retired. And then after he came out of retirement, it is off to Raiderland. But Eddie Lacy is one of those risk-reward acquisitions that the Seahawks made in the offseason. A talented guy that could pound and get you some big yards, but also times a guy that has let his weight get the best of him and injuries get the best of him as well. So it was an incentive-laden contract based on weight that the Seahawks signed him to. And so they're hoping for the best. And they need him at top level for sure. But the other part of that is the depth. And there's 2 guys, of course, that have to be talked about when we talk about the Seahawks running game. The first one is CJ Prosise, who a lot of people feel is the best running back in camp here in Seattle. And he's a guy that you can throw to, a guy that can run inside, outside, a lot of talent, but a guy that has been injured. It hasn't been on the field enough. So that's a big problem. And the other one is Thomas Rawls. He was the heir apparent to Marshawn Lynch, and he hasn't gotten He's been injured the last couple of years as well. So there's times he's shown his way. He's been able to do his 100-yard games, but there's also been times where he has been injured. So the running game is going to be very key. The Seahawks want to go back to that running style, that beast mode running style that made them so successful a couple of years ago when they were going to Super Bowls. They want to go back to that. So that's going to be very interesting going forward to see how the running game in training camp is going to play out. Number 3 is the health of Earl Thomas, who is considered, and in my opinion, the best safety in the National Football League. Certainly when he went down to injury to the Sunday night game last year to the Carolina Panthers, it was a different team, and you even saw that almost the play after Earl Thomas went down, Cam Newton was able to go deep and score a touchdown on them. And you even look back to the Green Bay Packer game last year, where Aaron Rodgers was able to carve up that Seahawks secondary like it's rarely been done before. So a guy like Earl Thomas is going to be very important to the team. He's like the heartbeat. He's the soul, I want to say the conscience of the team. And they need him back for them to be successful and have another Super Bowl run. They need him back at 100%, and it's starting in training camp. Looks good so far for Earl Thomas. He seems to be flying. Seems to be back to where he needs to be, which is great, but it's something to keep an eye on. The health of Earl Thomas going forward. And in addition to that, too, you look at a guy like Cam Chancellor, who's been on and off healthy, and certainly another heartbeat of the Seahawks. Thomas and Chancellor is the best safety combination in the National Football League. But they aren't the same without each other, certainly. So Chancellor needs to be healthy as well. We'll get into more secondary to spoil something a little bit later on. But number 2 is Russell Wilson. And Russell Wilson certainly, in Seahawks fans' mind, is one of the best quarterbacks in the National Football League, no question about it. But I don't know his perception outside Seattle's world. Certainly he had a good season last year, considering everything that happened, poor offensive line play, dealing with injuries, etc., etc., etc. But has he reached that elite, I can carry the team level? Yeah, 2 Super Bowls in a lot of people's mind, but stats, not always the prettiest of stats. So that hesitates for some people to put him in that upper echelon. But this is an opportunity for him this year to prove himself. And I also think something to his teammates as well. One of the big stories was in the offseason was how it seems to many people that Russell Wilson has a bit more leverage on this team and is allowed to do things that others aren't. And he doesn't face the same criticism that other players on the team do on a number of different levels. And I think he's got to endear himself a little bit to his teammates, I think. Yes, it's not about playing hurt. He played hurt. There's something more than that. He's come into camp back to combine weight, NFL combine and college weight at 208. So it's going to be interesting to see that he needs to move around. He needs to do the things that he's good at and continues to be good at. But I also think he needs to take another step this year to put himself in that elite category for Russell Wilson and for the Seahawks to go forward. He's obviously the face of the franchise. Nobody debates that. But I think Seattle loves him. The NFL doesn't have that same adoration for Russell Wilson. So that will be interesting going forward. And number 1 is Richard Sherman and the story of Richard Sherman. Let's go back to the last season, a game against the LA Rams, where the Seahawks were on the goal line. Stop if you've heard this story before. The Seahawks were at the goal line and did not score. And Richard Sherman got into a huge public camera-shown fight with offensive coordinator Darrell Bevell, to the point where it caused a lot of controversy in Seattle. Sherman was hostile to reporters. And there was rumors of trade. There was rumors Sherman was going to be traded in the offseason. He was seeking it. The Seahawks team was seeking it as well. And it turned out that he was back and everything is apparently hunky-dory. But in the back of many people's minds, and you wait till the first drive or the first play of the season where the Seahawks don't get in on a goal line stand, is it going to come back to haunt them again? Is that Sherman-Bevell discussion going to come back and haunt them again? And there's one side of this argument that says, you know what, Sherman, you got to get over this. You know, that was a couple of seasons ago. But at the same time, it's the same stuff that has cost the Seahawks championships. And the Seahawks defense is trying to keep the team on top and has been their rock and their backbone generally this decade. And Richard Sherman was considered one of the best cornerbacks in the National Football League, but last year he did not have a great season overall. I would say he's in the top 5, maybe top 10 cornerbacks right now in the National Football League, but I don't know if many people would have him number 1. He's the mouth of the Seahawks, and certainly color and fire and flair come from Richard Sherman, but I think we are looking this season for the substance of Richard Sherman. How is the substance of Richard Sherman going to look? And I think that will tell us a lot about how the Seahawks will play this season. So those are the 5 training camp stories that I am following for this year. Going to be a very interesting year in Seattle on a number of different things. And those are stories I'm following. If you like this video, like and subscribe to The Bottom Line View. You can follow me personally at Kevole. We'll talk about the Seahawks during the season. And thanks for watching this video. We'll speak to you soon.